At this moment, it's important for you to understand that I'm not here to tell you what you should or shouldn't believe. I'm not here to talk to you about what is currently being said about the Anunnaki in a metaphysical sense. I'm not here to talk about what many claim, that they can communicate with the Anunnaki, or that they receive information from the Anunnaki, or from books that have been psychographed, channeled, or that were simply the result of some kind of contact with a spiritual entity that might have something to say on this subject. That's not the position I'm in here.
Course originally recorded in Portuguese and dubbed using artificial intelligence. The course was recorded in 2022, when I was not yet a full-time YouTuber. The knowledge presented here is a treasure, as it brings the scientific foundations that qualified my research and are the resources I use to produce the videos on this channel. I know this dubbed voice is a bit monotonous. Although I speak English fluently, I chose to dub this content because it is older, and I wouldn't be able to re-record 10 videos with the same quality I managed to achieve back then.
This course is meant to give you a foundation, a base, so that you can understand how this whole subject comes about. That's why we took the path we did in videos 1 and 2. In the first video, you saw how all of this came about, how the theory emerged, who was the main promoter of this theory, how these books were built and put together, and how this story has reached us today, in this information age, at a time when there is a plurality of information and access to resources on the internet, with all sorts of YouTube videos and various phrases out there like forbidden film. They don't want us to know. They don't want us to find out, so that you can really understand where all of this originated with a truly solid foundation. In the second video, we looked at the tablets, how this mythology, these myths, originated and traveled through all this time until they became the theory that exists today. How these versions of the tablets broke through space and time and made it to the present day. And after all this reflection in the previous videos, we arrive at this third lesson, which is a historical video. It's a kind of historical reflection for you to understand who they are, not the Anunnaki, but the Sumerians, the people who talk about the Anunnaki. We'll soon understand how all of this works, just ahead. Before that, I need to clarify that each reflection we made at the end of the previous video about the men and women who gathered around the fire to tell stories is meant as a point for reflection. Most likely, things happened this way. One thing is certain, the tablets from Mesopotamia, the Sumerian, Akkadian, and Assyrian tablets did not appear as a defined collection of books. They didn't come about as a book in chronological order or as a collection in that way. They appear with different versions of the same story, and that's why it's so difficult for us to piece together a complete narrative about these myths. That said, let's try to understand how all of this begins from a more historical perspective. So, we're in the time of prehistory. Prehistory has a major milestone when we think about the development, the flourishing, the emergence of civilization itself. Civilization as we know it today, with all our houses and our entire social structure, began back in Sumer. That was about 4,000 to 6,000 years before Christ. That's what we know today, and it's possible that it may have started even earlier than that. It's important to mention here, in this context, what we also discussed in the previous video about the recently discovered archaeological site. It was discovered not that long ago, in the 1990s of the last century and millennium, and soon after, excavations began at the archaeological site of Göbekli Tepe. Today, we have information that it was most likely a place of worship and veneration of the gods, but we don't have evidence of an actual civilization because apart from the paintings that can be seen at Göbekli Tepe, we don't have texts, literature, or any sign of social organization. It is estimated that Göbekli Tepe was built about 10,000 years before Christ, which places it roughly 4,000 years before the advent of civilization with the Sumerian civilization. Before the rise of the Sumerian civilization, All human peoples and settlements were nomadic. The small villages that existed with humans or humanoids, strictly speaking, were all nomadic. In other words, when the resources of a certain region ran out, another region would be occupied. That settlement, that family, would move from that place in search of a new location where they could support their population. The Neolithic Revolution marks the beginning of civilization. It is then, as historians, sociologists, and anthropologists tell us, that agricultural sedentarism begins, where agriculture and livestock farming start. As far as current archaeological and historical knowledge goes, the Sumerian civilization appears as if out of nowhere. It emerges in this region between the Tigris and Euphrates, known as the Fertile Crescent. The Tigris and Euphrates, these two rivers that cross the region where present-day Iraq is located, is known as Mesopotamia or Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia means between rivers, and that's exactly where we are, between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Civilization, human settlements begin to inhabit a specific region and stop being nomadic. They master agriculture and animal husbandry. A new era begins, marking the start of civilization. One of the major milestones that we can say truly marks the beginning of civilization, besides agriculture and animal husbandry, is precisely writing. Sumerian writing is said to be in cuneiform form, that is, they used clay tablets that were baked or dried, and with a tool, a wedge, a curved instrument, they would make impressions on this clay. And so those ideograms, those symbols that can be translated into syllables and also into epithets, in the case of the names of some gods, they mark the beginning of writing. Being able to record information is not that simple, and at the same time, it's not something we can say isn't a major milestone. That's because when we imagine, many years ago, men and women hiding in caves from wild dangers, the dangers of the jungle and other animals, the cave paintings show us how they also passed on this knowledge to their children, their descendants, or even to other tribes and human groups who might come across that cave. By looking at drawings of animals, we could figure out what was happening and the dangers of a particular region. When civilization arises and writing appears as well, a great revolution takes place, because we can record everything, down to the smallest detail, and not necessarily through art. Something very interesting happens when we look at this from a philosophical perspective. We move from interpretation and artistic representation to an organized language in the true sense. We move from chaos to order, if we look at it from this point of view as well. I no longer need to draw to show that there is a danger, that there is an animal. I can record what is happening in writing. I can make several copies, and they don't have to be stuck on a cave wall, trapped inside. They can be distributed. And it's this notion of distribution that also defines civilization, because civilization spreads and expands around cities. Sumer is the first civilization that ever existed in human history, as far as we know today through archaeology and history. When this civilization emerges, different city-states also arise. These different city-states operated independently, even though, if we could say, in quotes here, the so-called countries of Sumer were kind of like the United States. They were city-states that acted independently, but all had a very similar organization. If we look at everything that began in Sumerian civilization, we'll notice a lot of things that are very similar to what we know today in our country and on our planet. That's because schools started there in Sumer. All this social organization, when it begins, creates a huge impact. Just imagine that when schools start, we need to decide who, how many, and how these people are going to learn. What will be learned? A city needs to be able to have everything. It needs to have people who produce food. It needs to have people who sell things. It needs people to take care of the animals, to look after the grains, to care for the children. And all of this is recorded on those tablets, those 30 to 40,000 clay tablets discovered back in the 19th century, around 1849, during the expeditions of Sir Austen Henry Layard. Not just him, other archaeologists, historians, anthropologists, and sociologists were part of this mission, which was funded by various museums around the world. It was the discovery of the Library of Nineveh, which is believed to have belonged to King Ashurbanipal II, with all those tablets that bring us all this historical information. Going back to the historical information we're looking at, there were also, as he mentioned, the schools. The schools, then, passed on all the knowledge. And you see, even back then, student life was anything but easy. It was understood that in order to learn, a certain kind of suffering was necessary, a kind of need for study, and it wasn't that simple. There were the scribes, those who recorded information on the tablets. There were also those who stored these tablets, whom we could consider the librarians of that time, although of course they didn't have that name. There were those who studied cures, and for anyone interested in studying this subject, it's very fascinating, because these cures and the first medicines also appeared in Sumer. And there are many studies about these medicines, which were mainly made with snakes, animal extracts, and other elixirs, other syrups that could be extracted from plants and animals. There is a scientific article that exists only in English and is very interesting to read, which is about the ancient pharmacy of Nippur, where these first medicines in the world are described. So, that's when pharmacy begins. We could also say that's when chemistry itself begins, and that's when healing starts. Medicine itself also begins through Sumer. This social organization also divides people into houses or, in some cases, huts or constructions, most of the time made of reeds. That was what was used at the time. Back then, there were already carts pulled by donkeys, so the wheel also already existed there. The Sumerians are also responsible for mathematics. Although the Pythagorean theorem is famous precisely because of Pythagoras, tablets have already been discovered, tablets from Mesopotamia with similar calculations. They also needed to organize trade and invented the sexagesimal counting system. I'm going to show you here on my fingers. Some people have already seen this in other videos, in other interviews of mine elsewhere, but I need to show it here, that they could count just using the palm of one hand, using these little folds we have here. So, starting from the thumb, we would count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. This sexagesimal system counted in measures of 12, a number that is still sacred to us today. And so they divided things into 12. Believe it or not, it also started in Sumer, astrology and astronomy as sciences that are interconnected. Let's open a parenthesis here to point out that the Sumerians were concerned with how celestial bodies could influence human life. And this influence on human life blends a lot of science, astronomy, and also astrology. It wasn't just about noticing whether a celestial body influenced my mood or my psychological state, or my personality at the moment of birth. It was necessary to understand this interaction between the stars and planet Earth, and how nature reacts in a general way. When the moon is positioned in a certain way, the grains should be placed in one way, and when the moon is not like that, they should be placed differently. When a strong star, which was actually a planet, was visible at a certain time, we should harvest those grains, or we should take one action or another. There were times when the days were longer, and other times when the days were shorter. So all of this structure of astrology and astronomy went hand in hand with agriculture. Let's close this parenthesis we've opened here, so we can return to the idea of the passage of time and understand that this 12 here, which I just showed, is connected to commerce, because that's how they did calculations with just one palm of the hand It was in mathematics. It was, and this is what I was going to say earlier, believe it or not, in the signs of the zodiac, in the months of the year. The 12 signs of the zodiac, the 12 months of the year, the day divided into 2 segments of 12 hours. And so, back then, opening another parenthesis here, there weren't 365 days in the year. They initially counted 360. And this sexagesimal system is also present, let's not forget, in the circle itself and in the concept of trigonometry that arises from this. All these things already had some connection and some kind of demarcation in Sumer. It was also in Sumer that the first codes of law began. Although the Code of Hammurabi is more well known, we have the Code of Ur-Nammu in Sumer. It was important for laws to be established, and in the book History Begins at Sumer by Samuel Noah Kramer, Samuel Noah Kramer talks with an American jurist who points out to him just how similar one of the earliest trials in history regarding a crime that took place back then is to a modern trial in the United States. He tells him that the verdict from that time, about 5,000 years ago, 4,000 years before Christ, would still be valid today, 7,000 years later. Just to give you an idea of the impact that the advent of Sumerian civilization still has on us today, it really makes us wonder, and in a very profound way, why aren't the things I'm saying here being widely shared? Why don't we have documentaries about this on television networks? And why isn't this information being taught in schools? That's how significant the impact of Sumerian civilization is. Today, when students study, just like it was in my time too, ancient history, we only get a brief mention about Sumerian tablets to tell us about the first type of writing that ever existed. And not to mention, then, that the first literature, the first literary text, the first epic in human history, at least as far as we know today, is the Epic of Gilgamesh, which speaks to us deeply as human beings. Because in the Epic of Gilgamesh, when we reach the end of this epic, we get the idea, the notion, and the conclusion that we are remembered for our deeds in life, instead of seeking immortality. If we think about the impact this has, from a religious point of view and everything we've been told throughout history, that our lives should be lived in such a way that we can find eternal life, or another life, we find ourselves confronted with Gilgamesh, who tells us that our deeds should be accomplished in this life. And this is the first literature in human history, the first epic text, which, since it was only discovered later, around the 19th century, and has been studied to this day, was very likely used by the Greeks to write the Iliad, as well as other texts that recount epics, or the Odyssey, right? These texts tell very similar stories. It is there, in Sumer, that our first hero in history emerges. If we can talk about Gilgamesh in this regard, we need to ask ourselves, then, how all of this comes about, how agriculture, livestock farming, schools, the measurement of time, medicine, astronomy, astrology, social organization, laws, buildings, and the shift away from a nomadic lifestyle all happen. We need to position ourselves, then, in light of all this, to ask the Sumerians, through the books of history and archaeology, to whom they attribute all this development and everything that brought them, and later brought to us, this entire social organization. And any of the black-headed people, which is how the Sumerians referred to themselves, would say that everything they learned, everything they knew, everything they put into practice is due to only one reason. And that's why this subject is so fascinating, because the Sumerians are categorical in stating, not in one text, not in two, but in several, that everything they learned is owed to the gods. And these gods are the Anunnaki gods. That's where the great historical, social, archaeological, and sociological importance of this subject comes from. That's why this topic, even though it can be seen today from this perspective and this point of view, which takes the spiritual aspect so much into account, we need to take a step back and look at what the real importance and impact are if we want to be taken seriously by scientists, archaeologists, and historians. We need to pay attention to this crucial point. This civilization that seems to appear out of nowhere. What does it mean for a civilization to seemingly appear out of nowhere? It doesn't mean that people were brought here in spaceships or that they literally came from nowhere. These people, these beings, were already living there. But this entire social organization emerges, and today there is no record of how it happened, and people say it came from nowhere and attribute everything they learned to these Anunnaki gods. These clay tablets, 30 to 40,000 of them, are, as I mentioned earlier, from the Library of Nineveh, which is said to have belonged to King Ashurbanipal II. This library doesn't just have Sumerian tablets, it also contains tablets from Akkad and Syria. It is also reported that there may be Chaldean documents, which is the empire that arose right after the fall of the Akkadian Empire. These tablets in this library, 40,000 of them, specifically tell about the Anunnaki, about mythology, about the creation of human beings. There are 40,000 tablets that contain commercial agreements, laws, and medicines. And then, yes, what has the greatest impact on our topic here, on what I like to research, and probably what you, who are watching, also enjoy and take pleasure in investigating, is that precisely in those tablets are the myths that mention the creation of human beings by the Anunnaki. This entire relationship they have with the gods is extremely important. One of the greatest achievements of all social organization, which I haven't mentioned until now, is that true monarchy begins on earth. I don't know if you've thought about this, but when we talk about all social organization, about everything that exists, it's almost impossible for us to imagine that all of this could exist without a ruler, or several rulers, without someone to maintain the structure, without someone to ensure that the law is enforced, without someone to question whether that law is still valid. So, back then, there were already kings, and they first appeared precisely in Sumer. And this is where I'm going to tell you what the word Sumer means. It means land of civilized kings. That's why Sumer is so important, because it's where the land of civilized kings emerges. Civilization, in the truest sense, is already present there. And earlier, when I mentioned the people of the black-head or black-headed people, this black-headed people in English is how the Sumerians referred to and defined themselves. That's why it's common in texts and myths to see this term, black-headed people. All of this interaction, then, took place between the king and a god, but it wasn't just the king. We also had members of the priestly class. We also had the priests, and it was only these two classes of people who could contact the divine world and serve as intermediaries between this divine world and the earthly world, the tangible world where things happened. It was the kings and the priests, the only ones who had access to the gods and to the god of each city. Yes, of each city, because in Sumer there were several city-states. In each of these city-states there was, at the very least, and this is a little further along in history, at least one structure called a ziggurat. This structure, called a ziggurat, was a pyramid-shaped, pyramidal structure. Many said that this was the place, the temple, where gods and men met. It was there, in the ziggurats, that human beings connected with the divine, where heaven and earth met. From whatever perspective we want to look at it, philosophical, anthropological, sociological, historiographical. How did this happen? That's not a question that archaeology and history are concerned with. When we read books by archaeologists and historians, it's common for us to sometimes get confused. What do you mean, contacting the gods? How could the Sumerians, Akkadians, and Assyrians contact the gods in the ziggurats? Because it was one of the king's duties to choose who the warriors should be to protect each city and to train these warriors for the possible situations of war that might arise. But this wasn't done without someone being consulted, the god responsible for each city, because there was a god for every city. We're not dealing with a monotheistic culture. We need to get that out of ourselves to understand the mindset of these human beings from so many millennia ago. We need to try to get monotheism out of our heads, which is actually a pretty recent invention in history when compared to the Sumerians. Monotheism first tries to emerge with Akhenaten in Egypt, which is already long after Sumer, and then it appears when God reveals himself to Abraham, initially called Abram, who changes his name after his encounter with God, a God defined in the Bible as Yahweh or Yahweh, however you want to call him. This Abraham, who changes his name to Abraham, is a Sumerian citizen from the city of Ur. So we start to see that the history of Sumer gets a bit mixed up with the very history of the Bible, or Hebrew mythology, right, when we begin to notice how these characters repeat themselves, how they appear in one place and are also mentioned in other places. But, as I was saying, to understand the mindset of the Sumerians and how all of this came about, we need to step out of this monotheistic context that we find ourselves in today in our society. Today, people who call themselves agnostics or atheists are agnostics or atheists in relation to this most worshipped entity on planet Earth, which comes from Hebrew mythology, Judeo-Christian mythology, and also from Islamic mythology, from the Muslims, which is Allah, or God, or Jehovah, or whatever name we want to give him. Back then, none of that existed. There were various gods being worshipped. In each city-state of Sumer, there was a specific god being worshipped in that city. This god would then contact only the king and the priest. Only these two classes had access to the god. Initially, these two classes were also the only ones who occupied the ziggurats. They say that later on, further ahead in history, other human groups, other people, other inhabitants, though these were the more valued members of society, were also allowed to circulate in the ziggurats, which had become the great fortresses of each of these cities, since they were sheltered far from neighboring territories, far from territorial borders, and also protected from any bad weather that might occur or any kind of mishap or unforeseen event. It was the best place of all. It was like the VIP box of the city itself. But before everyone, before a large number of people could have access to the ziggurat, it was only kings and priests with very specific roles who had contact with the god who would say and decide which wars should be fought or not. These gods, if we think about it, let's try to lay things out here. If we imagine here the Sumerian civilization itself, the very land of Sumer and the elevated constructions, the ziggurats, let's picture two of them here. The god responsible for this ziggurat, the god responsible for that ziggurat, or for the city, they decide to wage war against each other. And it's very similar to what happens today when our rulers decide to go to war with each other. The people and the warriors are the ones who go down to fight. These gods tell us in the myths that they also had disputes and wars among themselves. But we don't have any accounts from archaeologists and historians saying that these gods actually fought among themselves. If this were stated by historians and archaeologists, we would find ourselves at an interesting point where science itself would be saying that these gods were, in fact, flesh and blood. And this is a great mystery. We have no way of saying how this interaction actually took place. But in light of what we have extensively discussed in the previous and most recent class, we truly need to deeply think and carefully reflect that this profound interaction between human beings and their divine gods could indeed be a truly physical and tangible experience. It could very well be that these gods descended from their ships, from their chariots of fire as the Bible tells us, or from the Vimanas, as Hindu mythology describes, among other vehicles that are depicted and mentioned in so many other mythologies around the world. It could also be that they used these vehicles and positioned themselves just above the highest part of the city, the ziggurats or the mountains, like the famous Mount Ararat or Mount Sinai, or other mountains that existed at the time, and then descended to communicate with human beings. But it could also be that these gods are not tangible, not made of flesh and bone. It could also be that these ancient and powerful gods are indeed contactable within a profound spiritual realm, perhaps through a very specific kind of ritualistic trance that only a select few individuals were truly able to perform and master. And in that case, perhaps the priests had special access because of the abilities they possessed. We could get into a very interesting discussion here, considering that the myths and mysticism of that time might have allowed these priests to make contact with the metaphysical world, with what lies beyond the tangible, maybe with or without the use of any actual substance, perhaps with trance techniques or other abilities that allowed them to make contact. If we look at other cultures around the world, we can mention, for example, indigenous peoples themselves or even shamanism. We will see that not everyone is gifted or able to contact this otherworldly realm. Preparation is necessary, and, often, these secrets were passed down from generation to generation, with substances, with rituals, with things that were done to contact this other world. Those individuals who had this significant privilege often did not share these profound secrets, which consequently remained hidden, perhaps even exclusively within initiatory orders back in those ancient times. We need to remember how Egypt itself emerged, and the entire Egyptian civilization, and all the rituals that were performed inside the pyramids, and all the access that was said to exist to these gods. If these powerful, tangible gods are truly made of flesh and bone, perhaps these divine beings can also be contacted through various metaphysical means, such as spiritual communication or deep meditative practices. It's a great mystery if we analyze the past, the great mythologies of the world, the great sacred books, and the great founders of religions, and observe our current world, the way we relate to religion and to revelations. In ancient times, in the old world, there are many accounts that these gods, these deities, or these divine envoys and revelations walked here on planet Earth, that they were present here. On the other hand, nowadays we have the idea that these gods are not made of flesh and bone because they are not present here. But in our religious practice, we have ways to contact this divine world through our experiences, and only those who have ever felt something in a religious temple, or through some meditation, or through any kind of contact, can affirm and reaffirm the existence of a mysterious energy that we can access. At least, that's the idea I have. These gods and goddesses of the past, who somehow made contact with human beings, passed on to them all knowledge, all laws, all social organization, the workings of absolutely everything. When someone in a family fell ill, and we can read this in the tablets, the gods were asked for healing for those illnesses. We should also point out that it is very likely that tithing originated at that time, because a portion of the wealth, a percentage of what was produced in each city, was collected. That was the beginning of tax collection, including receipts, which are found on Sumerian tablets. These receipts and this portion of the city's production were taken to the ziggurat, where there was contact with the gods, and the sadna, this money, this portion of the production, this wealth was used for the maintenance of the city. It is said that the Sumerians managed to draw nutrients from the soil and could then channel water. This is also one of the great achievements of Sumerian civilization, and it is said that this may have been one of the major problems, because over time the marshes ended up drying out, and this could then end up destroying the entire social organization. This historical overview we've just seen provides the foundation and basis for many things that we will look at next. It's important to point out that the Sumerians never said at any time that the Anunnaki were extraterrestrials from a planet called Nibiru, which supposedly had a problem with its atmosphere and needed to mine gold. At no point, in all the tablets I've read to this day, in all my research, from all the historians and archaeologists, in everything I've ever seen, have I ever found this to have been stated. But it's necessary, at this point to say that maybe, if this information is true, it might simply not have been revealed to the general public yet, and we can already suspect why this hasn't been told to us. We wrap up our third lesson here, and I'll see you in our next video. See you then.